My name is Clara Holden. I'm 31 on 40 acres in Colorado. For 2 years, I brought supper to my neighbor Thomas Wheeler every Thursday. He was a widower, quiet, capable, never asked for a thing. I never said it, but those Thursday evenings were my whole week. Then one October evening, he smiled and said, "If I were 20 years younger, I'd marry you." I didn't laugh. I stepped closer and whispered, "What if I said yes right now as you are?" Thomas Wheeler was a man who had buried his wife under a cottonwood tree and then spent 5 years forgetting he was still alive. He was 20 years older than me, quiet as the high country, the kind of neighbor who would mend your fence before dawn and vanish before you could thank him. I was 31, running my parents' old place alone after they moved south. My Thursday suppers started as kindness, a hot meal for a widower on 40 acres. But the truth I never spoke aloud was that those evenings had become the center of my week. The sound of his rare, slow laugh, the way he looked at the mountains like they might give back what he had lost. Then, that October night, he made his gentle joke, and when I whispered my answer, the world stopped. The months that followed would prove that the bravest thing two lonely people can do is stop pretending they don't deserve to be loved. The silence that followed my whisper was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Thomas Wheeler stood frozen on his porch, the venison stew forgotten on the rail, his weathered hands motionless at his sides. The mountains behind him turned the color of old bruises as the sun dropped, and in that long, suspended moment, I saw a man who had spent 5 years believing that love was a door that had closed forever realize that maybe it had just been stuck. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a rasp. "Clara, I'm 62 years old. I buried the only woman I ever loved. You're young enough to be my daughter. You could have anyone." And I, with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth, said the truest thing I had ever spoken. "I don't want anyone. I want the man who hasn't missed a Thursday in 2 years without knowing I was counting." I should tell you how we got there, because it didn't start with a joke. It started with a casserole dish and a widower who had forgotten how to accept kindness. 2 years earlier, my parents had decided the Colorado winters were too much for their bones and moved to a retirement village near Pueblo. They left me the 40 acres, the old two-story farmhouse, and a herd of quiet that settled into the rooms like dust. I was 29 then, newly alone, and I discovered quickly that silence on a farm has a weight. It presses on you until you either break or learn to carry it. I learned, but the carrying was lonely. Thomas Wheeler's place sat just half a mile down the dirt road, a modest white house with a barn that leaned a little to the left and fields that had once grown alfalfa but now mostly grew goldenrod and memory. His wife, Eleanor, had died of ovarian cancer 5 years before. He didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about much of anything. But I noticed that his truck never went to town on grocery days, and when I drove past his kitchen window at dusk, the light was always dim, the stove cold. So one Thursday I made too much chicken and dumplings. I told myself it was neighborly. I told myself it meant nothing. I knocked on his door and handed him the dish and said, "I thought you might like a hot meal." He looked at the dish, then at me, like I had offered him something in a language he no longer spoke. Then he nodded once and said, "Thank you, Clara." That was all. The next Thursday I brought beef stew. The Thursday after that, pork chops and applesauce. He never asked for it, never expected it, never assumed. But every single week he was there on the porch when I arrived, as if he had been waiting without letting himself know it. Here is what you must understand about Thomas Wheeler. He was not a man who wore his sorrow loudly. He wore it like a second skin, so familiar that he had stopped noticing its weight. Eleanor's name was never spoken in town without the words shame, or so young trailing after it. She had been the heart of their land, a woman who could grow roses at 7,000 feet and who sang in the church choir with a voice that made old men weep. When she got sick, Thomas sold off half the cattle to pay for treatments that didn't work. When she died, he planted a cottonwood sapling over her grave on the hill behind the barn, and he stopped going to church. He stopped going anywhere, really, except the feed store and the occasional auction. People in town said he had become a ghost on his own land. I didn't see a ghost. I saw a man who had loved something so completely that its absence left a crater, and he was still learning to walk around the edges. I had my own craters, though I didn't show them either. When I was 26, I had been engaged to a man named Derek who worked for the county land office. He was charming, ambitious, and he saw my family's acreage as an investment opportunity. 2 months before the wedding, I overheard him on the phone with a developer, describing my land as the perfect spot for a ski access road once the old folks die off. I broke off the engagement that night. He told everyone I was unstable. A few people believed him. After that, I stopped trusting easy smiles. I threw myself into the farm, the vegetable patch, the small orchard, the roadside stand where I sold honey and preserves, and I convinced myself that solitude was strength. The Thursday suppers with Thomas became the one time each week when I stopped pretending. There, on his porch with the wide sky turning pink above us, I didn't have to be the capable young woman running a farm alone, or the jilted ex-fiancée, or the daughter who stayed behind. I could just be Clara, sitting beside a quiet man who never asked me to be anything else. For 2 years, that was enough. For 2 years, neither of us acknowledged the thing growing between us, the way our conversations stretched longer each week, the way his hand would brush mine when he took the dish, the way I started wearing my hair down on Thursdays even though I told myself it was just because the weather was warm. And then came that evening in late October, the 23rd, with a wind that smelled like snow and wood smoke. I had made venison stew from a buck one of the neighbors had shared, and I brought it over with a loaf of fresh sourdough. Thomas was in better spirits than usual. He had fixed a section of fence that had been down since spring, and there was a lightness in his shoulders that I hadn't seen before. We sat on the porch steps, eating from mismatched bowls, and he talked about Alina, not with the heavy grief of earlier years, but with a gentle fondness, telling me how she used to chase the deer out of the garden with a broom and a string of curses that would make a rancher blush. I laughed, and he looked at me with that slow smile that rearranged his whole face, and that was when he said it. If I were 20 years younger, Clara, I'd marry you. It was a joke. I knew it was a joke. But beneath the joke was a truth so heavy that the air bent around it. He was telling me in the only way he knew how that he had noticed me too, that he had thought about it, that the crater Alina left had grown wide enough to let another person in, and that person was me. So I didn't laugh. I set my bowl down on the step, stood up, and walked close enough to see the silver in his stubble and the lines around his eyes. My heart was beating hard enough to shake my voice, but I kept it steady. What if I said yes, right now as you are? He went still. The mountains behind him held their breath, and I saw in that long moment the exact second when hope broke through 5 years of grief like a green shoot through ash. He tried, of course, to talk me out of it. That night we went inside and sat at his kitchen table, the stew growing cold as he laid out every reason this was a mistake. I'm 20 years older. People will talk. Your parents will think I've lost my mind. I come with a lot of sad history, Clara, and I can't promise I won't ever get stuck in it. I listened to every word, then I reached across the table and took his hand. It was calloused and warm, and it closed around mine with a hesitancy that broke my heart. Thomas, I said, I've spent 2 years watching you from across a porch. I've spent my whole life being practical. If this is a mistake, let me make it. I'd rather make it with you than be right with anyone else. He looked at our joined hands for a long time. Then he nodded once, the same nod he had given me the first Thursday, and said, "All right, Clara, but we go slow, we do this right." I agreed. Neither of us knew what right would look like in a town like Silver Creek, where memory is long and forgiveness is short. The first month was quiet wonder. We didn't rush into announcements or paperwork. We simply stopped pretending that Thursday was the only day that mattered. I started coming over on Tuesdays to help with the woodpile, and he started showing up on Saturday mornings to fix the sagging gate on my south pasture. We cooked meals together in his kitchen, bumping elbows at the stove, and he told me stories about Alina that made me cry and stories about his own childhood that made me laugh until my ribs hurt. He kissed me for the first time on the 5th of November, under the cottonwood tree, with a gentleness that felt like asking permission. I kissed him back with a fierceness that felt like answering yes. And for a few precious weeks, we existed in a bubble of our own making, two people who had stopped being lonely, and the world outside did not matter. Then the town woke up. The first sign of trouble came at the Silver Creek General Store in mid-November. I was buying flour and sugar when Madeline Cross, who had been Alina's closest friend, cornered me near the dairy case. Her face was pale and tight. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time at Thomas Wheeler's place," she said, her voice carrying that particular brand of small-town concern that is really righteous indignation. "Alina hasn't even been gone 6 years. Don't you think it's a little soon?" I gripped my shopping basket and said calmly, "Thomas is a grown man. What he does is his business." Madeline's eyes narrowed. "He's a vulnerable man who never got over his wife, and you're young enough to be taking advantage of that." The people in the nearby aisles stopped pretending to shop. I felt their stares like needles. I didn't answer. I paid for my flour and walked out, but the words followed me home like a splinter I couldn't remove. Within a week, the rumors had spread across Silver Creek like a grass fire. Clara Holden is after Thomas Wheeler's land. Clara Holden is trying to replace Alina before the grave grass has grown. Clara Holden has manipulated a lonely old man because she can't find a husband her own age. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Thomas, when I told him, set his jaw and said, "They'll tire of it. They always do." But I saw the way his shoulders tightened when we drove into town together, the way he stopped smiling at people because they no longer smiled back. And then Margaret Sterling entered the picture. Margaret Sterling was a real estate developer from Denver who had been buying up farmland in the valley for years, turning pastures into vacation rentals and alfalfa fields into gravel parking lots. She had approached Thomas twice about selling his 40 acres, and both times he had refused without even looking at her offers. The land had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had homesteaded it. His father had died on it. Alina was buried on it. It was not for sale, and Margaret Sterling did not take no gracefully. When she heard about Thomas and me, she saw an opportunity. She started appearing at town council meetings, dropping hints about elder care concerns and predatory relationships. She hired a private investigator, a thin man with a clipboard and too many questions, who started asking neighbors about my finances and Thomas's mental state. I didn't know this at the time. All I knew was that one morning in early December, a letter arrived from the county registrar's office, stating that an anonymous complaint had been filed questioning the validity of Thomas's property boundaries. A survey would be required to confirm his claim to the eastern pasture, where Alina's cottonwood stood. If the survey found discrepancies, the land could be reclassified as county property and sold at public auction. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his face turning gray. "This is Margaret," he said quietly. "She found a weak spot in the old records and she's going to squeeze it until I either sell or lose everything." I put my hand on his arm. "Then we fight it. We get a lawyer. We prove the land is yours." He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not just fear for the land, but fear for us. "Clara, this isn't just about property lines. She's trying to prove I'm not fit to manage my own affairs. If she can show that my judgment is compromised." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I realized then that our love was being wielded as a weapon. The thing that had saved us both was being twisted into evidence that he was a confused old man being taken for a ride by a younger woman. And the worst part was, I could see the doubt creeping into his own heart, the old grief whispering that he didn't deserve happiness, that maybe everyone was right. The next Sunday, Margaret Sterling herself showed up at the cottonwood tree. She was tall, dressed in a wool coat that cost more than my whole winter wardrobe, and she smiled with the kind of cold courtesy that masks a knife. Thomas and I were walking the property line, marking fence posts, when her silver SUV pulled up on the dirt road. She got out and stood with the mountains behind her, looking at the land like she already owned it. "Mr. Wheeler," she called, "I hope we could talk sensibly. The county survey is going to happen whether you cooperate or not. Why not sell to me now at a fair price and avoid the embarrassment of a public hearing? You could take the money, travel a little, enjoy your new companion." She glanced at me with a dismissiveness that felt like a slap. Thomas stepped in front of me. "I've told you before, the land isn't for sale." Her smile didn't waver. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Wheeler. The question is whether you want to lose it with dignity or lose it with a scandal. The county is very interested in why a man your age has suddenly entered a relationship that directly affects land inheritance. They might even require a mental competency evaluation. She let that hang in the cold air, then turned and walked back to her car. As the engine roared away, I felt Thomas's hand find mine. It was trembling. "She's going to destroy us," he whispered. And I, looking at the cottonwood where Alina's spirit seemed to be watching, answered with a certainty I didn't quite feel. "Not if we destroy her first." But I had no idea then that the real battle wasn't with Margaret Sterling at all. It was with something much closer to home, something that had been waiting under that tree for 6 years to finally speak. I didn't uncover it that night, or the next day, or even the next week. The truth, when it finally surfaced, came not with a scream, but with the soft scratch of a shovel against metal. It came after the surveyors had already trampled the eastern pasture with their tripods and orange stakes, after Margaret Sterling had filed a formal petition with the county questioning Thomas's mental competence, and after I had started waking up at 3 in the morning with the taste of dread in my mouth. The attorney we hired, Grant Morrison, was a tall, tired man in his late 40s who wore rumpled suits and had the weary eyes of someone who had seen too many land disputes turn ugly. He met us in Thomas's kitchen on the 4th of December, spread a stack of old property records across the table, and said the words that cracked the foundation of everything I thought I knew about the man I loved. "The property line dispute is a smokescreen," Grant said, tapping a yellow document with his finger. "Margaret's people know the original survey from 1942 is rock solid. What they're actually after is in here." He slid a photocopy across the table. It was the original deed to the Wheeler property, dated July 11, 1944, and the name at the top was not Thomas Wheeler Sr. It was Alina Margaret Vance. The land had been purchased by Alina's father and deeded directly to her when she married Thomas. At the time, it was an unusual arrangement. Most property went to the husband. But Alina's father was a stubborn man who believed his daughter should have security in her own name. When Alina died, the land passed to Thomas by right of survivorship, but the chain of title was never as clean as anyone assumed. And somewhere, Grant believed, there might be a will or a codicil that Alina had written before her death, a document that could change everything. Thomas stared at the deed with an expression I couldn't read. "Alina never told me the land was hers," he said quietly. "I always thought my father left it to us. We signed papers when we married, but I never looked closely. She handled the legal side of things." Grant leaned forward. "If she made a will that placed conditions on inheritance and it was properly witnessed but never probated, it could still be enforceable. And if Margaret Sterling knows about it, that would explain her aggression." The question hung in the room like smoke. Did Alina leave conditions? And if so, what were they? We spent the next 3 days tearing the house apart. Every drawer, every closet, every dusty box in the attic that hadn't been touched since the funeral. Thomas moved through the rooms like a man searching for something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. On the second night, I found a small leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of canning jars in the pantry. It was Alina's handwriting, looping and graceful, dated from the final year of her illness. Most of the entries were ordinary garden notes, whether observations, a recipe for peach preserves, but near the end the tone shifted. She wrote about the land, about her father's legacy, about her fear that Thomas would be left alone and vulnerable. And then on a page dated March 2nd, 2 months before she died, she wrote, "I've told him there's a box under the cottonwood tree. I told him to open it only if he ever falls in love again. He promised he would, he promised." I read that passage aloud to Thomas at the kitchen table. His face went pale, then red, then pale again. "She did say that," he whispered, pressing his palms against his eyes. "On one of her last good days, she made me promise. She said there was something under the tree, something that would make sense if I ever remarried. I thought it was a sentimental thing, letters, maybe a piece of jewelry. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to dig there. It felt like disturbing her rest. And then the years passed and I forgot. I closed the journal and set it down. Thomas, we have to dig it up now." We waited until dusk, when the mountains turned purple and the cold crept into the joints of the old cottonwood. I carried the shovel. Thomas carried a flashlight and a heavy heart. The tree stood black against the fading sky, its bare branches scratching at the first stars. At the base, where a flat stone marked the spot where Alina's spirit was said to rest, we began to dig. The ground was half frozen, and each shovelful came up with a sound like grinding teeth. It took 20 minutes before the blade struck metal. An old army green ammunition box, rusted at the hinges, buried less than 2 feet from the headstone. Thomas knelt in the dirt and lifted it out with trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and still dry, were 2 envelopes. One was labeled "For Thomas, with love." The other was labeled to be opened by the county clerk in the event of Thomas Wheeler's remarriage. That second envelope was a legal document, sealed with red wax, and it was dated just 3 weeks before Alina died. We opened the first envelope at the kitchen table that night. The letter inside was 6 pages long, written in the same looping hand as the journal. I read it aloud while Thomas sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped on the table like a man in prayer. Alina's words were gentle but unflinching. She wrote about the love she and Thomas had shared, about the 30 years of a marriage that had been the foundation of her life. And then she wrote about the land. Her father, Henry Vance, had bought those 40 acres in 1944 with money he earned working double shifts in the Denver rail yards. It was the first piece of property anyone in the Vance family had ever owned, and Henry had deeded it to Alina on her wedding day with a single instruction: keep it in the family. If Alina had no children, and she and Thomas had tried, but cancer had taken that possibility before it could take her life, then the land was to pass to her sister's children after Thomas's death. The sister, Patricia Vance, had married a man named Robert Sterling. Margaret Sterling was their daughter. Margaret was Alina's niece by blood, and the legal envelope contained a codicil to Alina's will, properly witnessed by a notary and 2 neighbors who had since died, stating that if Thomas ever remarried, the land was to be sold at market value and the proceeds split equally between Thomas and the surviving Vance heirs, which meant Margaret. The room went so quiet I could hear the wind pushing against the window glass. Thomas didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was raw. She was trying to protect her family's legacy. She didn't think I would ever marry again. She called it a sensible precaution. He looked up at me and his eyes were wet. I don't think she ever imagined someone like you, Clara, someone who would bring me back to life. I reached across the table and held his hand. So what does this mean for us? It meant that Margaret Sterling had known about the codicil all along. She had been waiting, probably for years, for Thomas to either die or remarry. When she heard the rumors about us, she must have felt like she had won the lottery. Her lawyer had the notarized copy of the codicil, and she would present it at the competency hearing as proof that Thomas's relationship with me was triggering the sale clause, and that he was resisting a legally binding directive. She could argue that his refusal to sell proved mental incapacity, that he was being manipulated by me into defying his late wife's express wishes. The whole strategy was diabolical. First, she planted the anonymous complaint about property lines to force a survey. Then, when the survey inevitably confirmed the boundaries, she would pivot to the codicil and use it to argue that Thomas was unfit to manage his own affairs because he was being controlled by a woman half his age who stood to gain from his land. If the county agreed, they could appoint a conservator, who would then sell the property to Margaret at a price she dictated. I felt the walls closing in. "If I leave," I said slowly, "if we end this now before the hearing, the sale clause doesn't activate. You keep the land. Margaret has no case." Thomas's grip on my hand tightened until it almost hurt. "No," he said, flat and final. "I'm not trading you for 40 acres. Alina loved this land, but she loved me more. She wouldn't want me to be alone again just to hold on to dirt. The codicil was a mistake made in fear, and I won't let it dictate my life." I shook my head. "Thomas, you could lose everything. The house your father built, the field where Alina is buried, the heritage your family has kept for 3 generations, all of it." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark shape of the cottonwood against the stars. "Then I lose it," he said, his voice breaking but steady. "But I will not lose you. I've already buried 1 wife. I won't bury the chance to love again." The days that followed were a blur of legal consultations and sleepless nights. Grant Morrison took the codicil to a handwriting expert in Denver, who confirmed the signature was authentic. The witnesses were dead, but the notary's records were still on file at the county courthouse. There was no question the document was genuine. Our only hope was to challenge it on technical grounds. Alina had been heavily medicated in her final weeks, and a doctor might testify that she lacked the capacity to make contractual decisions. But that would mean dragging Thomas through a hearing where his wife's dying days would be picked apart by lawyers, where her pain would become evidence, and where the love he had cherished for 30 years would be reduced to a psychiatric evaluation. The alternative was to accept the codicil, let the land be sold, and take half the proceeds, enough for Thomas to buy a smaller place maybe, but not enough to keep the home Alina had loved. And Margaret would get the other half, along with the satisfaction of finally possessing the 40 acres she had coveted for years. Then, 3 days before the hearing, something happened that changed everything again. I was going through the box of papers we had taken from the attic, looking for anything that might help when I found a second letter, this one addressed not to Thomas but to Patricia Vance, Alina's sister. It had never been sent. The envelope was sealed and stamped, but the postmark was smudged, and it had been tucked inside a book of poetry that Alina had given to Thomas for Christmas in 1989. I opened it with shaking hands. The letter was short, and it was an apology. Alina wrote that she had made a terrible mistake with the codicil. She had written it in a moment of weakness, afraid that Thomas might be taken advantage of by someone who didn't love him, and she had since realized that the document was a betrayal of the trust her husband had always placed in her. She begged her sister to destroy her copy of the codicil and to promise never to use it against Thomas. "He is a good man," she wrote, "and he deserves to keep the land our family built together. If I am gone, let him have peace." The letter was dated 5 days after the codicil. 5 days. She had written the codicil on March 10th, and by March 15th she had changed her mind. But the cancer was moving fast, and she had been too weak to go to the courthouse to revoke it. She had written to Patricia instead, trusting her sister to do the right thing. And Patricia, dying of a stroke just a year after Alina, had never received the letter. It had been lost in this book for 6 years, sitting on a shelf in Thomas's attic while Margaret Sterling plotted and waited and sharpened her knives. I read the letter to Thomas and Grant in the lawyer's office, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something like hope flicker in Thomas's eyes. Grant took the letter to a document analyst, who confirmed that the paper, ink, and handwriting all matched the undisputed letters from Alina's final weeks. It was a direct contradiction of the codicil. If the codicil represented Alina's last wishes, this letter superseded it in time and intent. It was dated later, it was addressed to the primary beneficiary of the codicil, and it explicitly instructed the destruction of the earlier document. It might not be a legally executed revocation, but in front of a sympathetic judge, it could be enough. It was a sliver of light in a very dark tunnel, and the hearing was in 72 hours. We spent those 3 days preparing as if our lives depended on it, because in every way that mattered, they did. Rosa, my only real friend in Silver Creek, organized a group of neighbors who had known Alina and Thomas for decades, and they wrote letters testifying to Thomas's character and mental clarity. Father Michael from the Catholic Church agreed to speak about the sanctity of marriage and the cruelty of using a dead woman's fears to destroy a living man's happiness. The town, which had been so quick to whisper and judge, began to fracture. Some people saw the truth now, that Margaret was a predator using the legal system as a weapon, but others still viewed me as an interloper, a younger woman who had seduced a grieving widower for his land. The whispers continued, but now there were voices on our side too, and through it all, Thomas held my hand and refused to waver. "Whatever happens in that courtroom," he told me the night before the hearing, "I am grateful. Not for the land or the lawyer or the fight, for you, for the last 2 years, for the Thursday suppers that made me remember I was still alive." We stood under the cottonwood tree, and I kissed him, and I thought about Alina's letter, about a woman who had loved her husband so much that she had tried to fix her mistake even as her body was failing. I owed her something, I realized. Not just gratitude for changing her mind, but gratitude for loving Thomas first, for making him the man I had fallen in love with. The hearing would decide the land, but it wouldn't decide us. That much I finally believed. But I was wrong. The hearing would decide more than I ever imagined, because Margaret Sterling had one more card to play, and it wasn't about the land at all. It was about a secret so deeply buried that even Thomas didn't know it, a secret that Alina had taken to her grave, and that only Margaret's investigator had uncovered. And when it came out, it would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man I was ready to spend my life with. The morning of the county hearing, the sky over Silver Creek was the color of old pewter, heavy with snow that hadn't decided whether to fall. Thomas wore the same dark suit he had worn to Alina's funeral, and when I helped him button the collar, my hands brushed the scar on his neck, a thin white line from a farming accident decades ago, and I felt him shiver. "Whatever happens in that room," I said, "we walk out together." He nodded but didn't speak. Grant Morrison met us on the courthouse steps, his briefcase stuffed with affidavits and the letter that might save us. But the moment we walked through the double doors, I knew something had shifted. The air in the hearing room was thick with anticipation, and Margaret Sterling sat at the front table with her lawyers, dressed in severe navy blue, her face calm and sharp as a blade. She did not look at us. She looked at the judge's empty chair like she had already won. The hearing was called to order by Judge Patricia Hanrahan, a stern woman in her 60s with glasses on a chain and the kind of measured voice that could strip the emotion from any argument. Grant presented our case first: the deed, the codicil, Alina's second letter, the testimony of Father Michael and the neighbors. He argued that the codicil had been effectively revoked by Alina's own hand, that Thomas was the legal owner, and that Margaret Sterling's petition was a transparent land grab. It was a strong case, and I watched the judge's face for any sign of sympathy. But Margaret's lead attorney, a sleek man from Denver named Julian Cross, barely reacted. He waited until Grant finished, then rose with the confidence of a man holding a card no one else knew existed. "Your Honor," he said, "the codicil is not our primary argument. Miss Sterling is here today because she has a prior claim to the Wheeler property, a claim that predates the marriage between Thomas Wheeler and Alina Vance, a claim of blood." The courtroom stirred. I looked at Thomas, but his eyes were fixed on Margaret, and his face had gone still in a way that frightened me. Cross continued, "Margaret Sterling is not merely Alina Vance's niece by marriage. She is the biological daughter of Thomas Wheeler, born from an affair he had with Patricia Vance in 1962, while he was engaged to Alina. Alina discovered the pregnancy and, to avoid scandal, arranged for Patricia to marry Robert Sterling, who agreed to raise the child as his own. This arrangement was kept secret from Thomas Wheeler, who never knew he had fathered a child. And the land that Alina's father deeded to her, the land now in dispute, was always intended to stay in the family bloodline. Margaret Sterling is the last living descendant of that bloodline. She is Thomas Wheeler's natural heir, and the law must recognize her rights." The words took a moment to register, like a delayed echo. Then Thomas stood up, his chair scraping the floor. "That's a lie," he said, his voice shaking but loud. "I never touched Patricia. I loved Alina my whole life." "I never," Cross spun around. "DNA doesn't lie, Mr. Wheeler. We have a certified test linking Margaret Sterling to you with 99.99% probability. The sample was obtained from a drinking glass discarded at your home last month. Alina knew about the child. She left a letter for Patricia, which we have in evidence, acknowledging the truth and begging her sister to keep the secret to protect your marriage. You may not have known, sir, but the truth is the truth. You have a daughter. And that daughter has been denied her inheritance for 47 years. I turned to Thomas. He was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white, and his eyes were wet with a confusion so profound it looked like physical pain. The judge called for order, but the murmuring in the room was a living thing, and I could feel every pair of eyes on the man beside me. The man who had just discovered that his entire history, his marriage, his grief, had been built on a foundation of secrets. Grant leaned over and whispered fiercely, "We need a recess. This is ambush evidence, Your Honor. We haven't had time to verify. Judge Hanrahan raised her hand. I'm granting a 24-hour continuance. Mr. Morrison, you may examine this DNA evidence and prepare a response. But understand, if this claim is valid, it fundamentally alters the nature of this hearing. Margaret Sterling may have standing not as a creditor but as an heir. This court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. The gavel came down and the room erupted. Margaret Sterling walked past our table without a glance, her heels clicking on the tile like a countdown. Thomas didn't move. I put my hand on his arm and felt the tremor running through him, a vibration of disbelief that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than bone. "Thomas," I said softly, "we need to go home." He turned to me, and his eyes were those of a man who had just been told that his life was a story someone else had written. "If it's true," he whispered, "then Alina lied to me for 30 years. My marriage was a lie, everything I thought I knew." He couldn't finish. I led him out of the courthouse into the cold December air, and we drove back to the farm in a silence so heavy that the truck's engine seemed to be the only sound left in the world. That evening, Grant called with the DNA report. It was real. The chain of custody was clean, the lab was accredited, and the probability was conclusive. Thomas Wheeler was Margaret Sterling's father, and the letter from Alina to Patricia, dated 1963, was written in Alina's unmistakable hand. In it, she thanked her sister for agreeing to raise the child, promised to keep Thomas in the dark forever, and said she believed it was the only way to preserve the family name and the land her father had worked so hard to own. I read the letter aloud in the kitchen while Thomas sat with his head in his hands. When I finished, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I remember that year. Patricia was gone for 6 months. A nervous condition, they said. I never questioned it. I never once looked at that baby and saw." He stopped. "What do I do with this, Clara? That woman out there, the woman trying to destroy us, she's my own flesh. And I never knew." I knelt in front of him and took his hands. "You grieve the truth you never knew. You mourn the father you might have been. But you don't let this break us. She's not your enemy, Thomas. She's your daughter. And maybe that's the only thing that can save us." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, hope and terror and something that might have been the first stirring of a love he didn't yet understand. "I can't lose this land," he said. "It's all I have left of Alina, of my father, of the life I thought I lived." I squeezed his hands. "Then we find a way to keep it, together." But Margaret had other plans. At 10 o'clock that night, while we were still reeling, a figure moved through the darkness at the edge of the eastern pasture. The cottonwood tree stood frozen under a light snowfall, and beneath it, a shadow knelt with a can of gasoline. I know this because the neighbor's security camera caught it. A grainy image of a man in a heavy coat pouring liquid around the base of the tree where Alina was buried. He lit a match, and the fire leaped up in a sudden orange roar that painted the snow the color of rust. By the time I saw the glow from the bedroom window and shouted for Thomas, the flames were already climbing the cottonwood's trunk, eating their way toward the branches that had sheltered Alina's grave for 6 years. Thomas ran out without a coat and I followed, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the barn. The heat was immense, the fire crackling so loudly it drowned out our voices. Thomas beat at the flames with a wet blanket while I sprayed the extinguisher, but the fire had spread to the dry winter grass, and for a terrible minute I thought we would lose the whole pasture and the house beyond it. Then the volunteer fire truck from town came screaming up the dirt road, and the men in yellow coats worked for an hour to bring it under control. When it was over, the cottonwood was blackened and half gone, a skeletal ruin against the snow. But the tree was still standing, and Alina's grave, though scorched, was undisturbed. The sheriff arrived at midnight. He had already arrested the man from the security footage, a local drifter named Hank Loomis, who had a record of petty arson and who confessed within minutes of being picked up. He said a woman had paid him $500 to send a message by burning the tree. He didn't know her name, but he described her as tall, well-dressed, driving a silver SUV. Margaret Sterling. The sheriff charged her with conspiracy to commit arson, and by morning she was in a holding cell. But the damage to the hearing was done. Her lawyer played the victim, arguing that Margaret's emotional state had been destabilized by the sudden revelation of her paternity, and that Thomas's refusal to acknowledge her had driven her to desperation. He petitioned the judge to delay the hearing indefinitely, pending a psychological evaluation of Margaret and a full investigation into the fire. Grant Morrison called me at 7. "The judge is furious," he said, "but she's also sympathetic. This is a family tragedy now, not just a property dispute. If we push hard, we might still win the land. But if we do, Thomas loses his daughter for good, and that's a loss no court can fix." I carried that weight with me as I stood in the kitchen, watching the sunrise over the scarred pasture. Thomas came down a few minutes later, his eyes red from a sleepless night. He had made a decision. "I want to see her," he said. "Before the hearing, I want to talk to my daughter." We went to the county jail. Margaret Sterling sat behind a glass partition, her perfect hair now limp, her face stripped of its cold confidence. She looked younger without her armor, and for the first time I saw the resemblance to Thomas in the shape of her jaw and the deep-set eyes. She stared at him with a hatred that was really hurt, and she didn't speak. Thomas leaned into the intercom and said, very softly, "I don't remember that night with your mother. I was young and drunk and stupid, and I've spent my whole life trying to be a good man because of it. If Alina hid you from me, she did it to protect me from my own mistake. But you are not a mistake, Margaret. You're my daughter. I can't give you back the years I missed, but I can stop fighting you. The land is yours too if you want it. We can share it, or we can sell it and split the money. Whatever you choose, I choose to be your father, starting now." Margaret's composure cracked. A single tear slid down her cheek, and her voice, when it came, was hoarse. "I don't want your land," she whispered. "I wanted to know why I wasn't enough to be claimed. I wanted to hurt you the way I've been hurting my whole life." Thomas pressed his palm against the glass. "I'm here now. It's late, but I'm here." She closed her eyes and didn't answer. But something in the room had shifted, the way the air changes just before a storm breaks. The hearing reconvened 2 days later, and the judge looked at the DNA evidence, the fire investigation, and the letter from Alina to Patricia. Margaret's lawyer tried to argue that the land should pass directly to her as the biological heir, but Grant was ready. He produced Alina's second letter, the apology, and argued that it was the final expression of her intent, that Thomas should keep the land free of any conditions. And he argued that Margaret's actions, including the arson, demonstrated that she was not a fit custodian for the property. But then Margaret stood up and addressed the court directly, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm not here for the land anymore. I'm here because this man is my father and I want to know him. I withdraw my petition. I don't want the sale. I don't want the money. I just want to be in the same room with him without a glass wall between us." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hanrahan looked at Thomas. "Mr. Wheeler, how do you respond?" Thomas rose, and I saw the weight of 62 years on his shoulders, but his voice was steady. "She's my daughter, Your Honor. I want to give her a home if she'll have it. Not the land, the home, the house, us." He reached for my hand. "Clara and me." That was the moment when the case became something else entirely. The judge dismissed the competency petition with prejudice, declaring the codicil unenforceable and Thomas the legal owner of the land. She then ordered a family mediation, not a hearing, to determine how the property might be shared. Margaret was released on bail for the arson charge, but Thomas refused to press the case as a victim, and the district attorney eventually offered her a plea deal, community service and counseling. The battle for the land was over. The battle for a family was just beginning. But here is the thing about families forged in fire. They don't break the way you think they will. The weeks after the hearing were the hardest of my life, not because of the scandal or the town gossip, which quieted once the truth came out, but because I had to watch the man I loved learn to be a father to a daughter who had tried to destroy him. And I had to find my own place in that new geometry, a place I wasn't sure existed. Margaret started coming to Sunday dinners, stiff and guarded, and Thomas spent hours with her on the porch, talking about Alina, about Patricia, about the years that had been stolen. I cooked the meals and gave them space, but at night in our bedroom, Thomas would hold me and whisper, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a father and a husband and not lose either." I told him the truth. "You'll learn, and I'll be here while you do." The turning point came on a snowy evening in January when Margaret showed up at the farm unannounced, her car packed with boxes. She had lost her apartment, the legal fees had drained her savings, and she had nowhere else to go. She stood on the porch like a stray animal, too proud to ask and too desperate to leave. Thomas didn't hesitate. He opened the door and said, "This is your home now if you want it." And Margaret, for the first time, collapsed into her father's arms and wept like the child she had never been allowed to be. I stood in the hallway, watching them, and I understood that the land had never been the prize. The prize was this: a family stitched together from broken pieces, a home where two lonely people had become four, and a love that had survived a war with the past. As the snow fell outside the old farmhouse, I whispered the same words I had said on the porch 2 Octobers ago. What if I said yes? And this time the answer wasn't a whisper. It was the sound of a door closing, and for the first time in years, it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like something finally beginning. The winter that followed was not an easy one. Margaret moved into the spare bedroom down the hall, the room that had once been Alina's sewing room. And for the first few weeks, the three of us circled each other like skittish animals unsure of the new territory. She was a stranger with Thomas's eyes and Alina's sharp jawline, a living reminder of a betrayal no one had intended. And I will admit there were nights when I lay awake listening to the wind and wondering if we had made a terrible mistake. But Thomas, who had spent 62 years being a quiet man, became something else in the face of fatherhood. He was patient in a way that astonished me. He didn't push Margaret to talk, didn't demand explanations or apologies. He simply showed up every morning with a fresh pot of coffee and a question about her day. He taught her how to split wood, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to tell when the chickens were stressed. And Margaret, who had spent 4 decades building walls out of anger and ambition, began, brick by brick, to take them down. I remember the first time I saw her laugh, really laugh, not the cold, dismissive sound she had used at the market or the courthouse. It was a bitter February afternoon, and a goat had gotten into the vegetable patch and eaten half the winter kale. Margaret had chased it through the snow, slipping twice, her expensive boots ruined, and when she finally cornered the animal by the barn, it turned and bleated directly in her face. She doubled over, shrieking with laughter, and Thomas and I stood on the porch watching, and I knew in that moment that she was going to be all right. The land, which had been a weapon, was becoming a home. Spring came late to the high country, but when it arrived, it came all at once. The snow melted into the creeks, the pasture greened, and the old cottonwood tree, which everyone had assumed was dead, sent up a single green shoot from its blackened trunk. I saw it first, early one morning while I was checking the fence line, and I knelt in the wet grass and touched the new growth with something close to reverence. Alina's tree was still alive. I brought Thomas out to see it, and he stood silently for a long time, then said, "She was always tougher than anyone gave her credit for." That afternoon, he and Margaret worked together to build a protective wire cage around the sapling, and I watched them from the kitchen window, the father and the daughter, their heads bent together over the task, and felt something shift inside my chest, a letting go of the fear I had been carrying since the night of the fire. The town, too, slowly changed its tune. Small towns have long memories but short attention spans, and once the scandal of the hearing had faded, people began to see the truth of what was happening at the Wheeler farm. The Thursday suppers I had once brought in secret became open invitations. Rosa came often, and Father Michael, and even Madeline Cross, who had accused me of taking advantage of Thomas in the grocery store, showed up one Sunday with a peach pie and an apology that must have cost her dearly. She sat at our kitchen table and told Thomas that Alina had been her best friend, and she had let grief turn into judgment, and she hoped he could forgive her. Thomas, who had learned a great deal about forgiveness that winter, simply nodded and offered her coffee. The land, which had nearly been torn apart by legal battles and old secrets, was becoming a gathering place, and the house, which had been so quiet for so many years, was filling with voices. On the first day of May, exactly 7 months after the night I whispered my answer on his porch, Thomas Wheeler asked me to marry him. We were sitting on the new bench he had built at the edge of the eastern pasture, the one carved with both our initials under the shade of the recovering cottonwood. The sky was pink and orange, the way it had been that October evening, and he took my hand with the same gentle hesitation he had shown the first time he touched me. "I'm not 20 years younger," he said softly, "and I can't give you all the years you deserve, but I can give you every year I have left, if you'll have them." I was 31 years old, and I had spent too much of my life believing that love was something that happened to other people. I looked at this man, the silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the scar on his neck, and the heart that had survived more than any heart should, and I said yes without a single reservation. The joke he had made on the porch had become a question, and the question had become a promise, and the promise was the most real thing I had ever known. We married on the farm on the 23rd of June, the longest day of the year, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at it. The ceremony was held in the pasture, with folding chairs borrowed from the church and wildflowers in mason jars tied to the fence posts. Father Michael wore his good robes and a smile that split his face. Rosa was my maid of honor. She cried through the entire thing and later claimed it was allergies. Margaret stood beside her father, wearing a simple gray dress and an expression that hovered between pride and disbelief. She had spent the previous month helping me plan the wedding, and somewhere in the process of choosing flowers and baking cakes, she had stopped being Thomas's estranged daughter and started being my something like a friend. When she handed me the ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to my grandmother, she whispered, "Take care of him. He's better with you." I promised I would. The ring I gave Thomas was Eleanor's wedding band, the same one he had placed on her finger 40 years earlier. We had talked about it for a long time, he and I, about whether it was right to use it. In the end, Thomas decided that Eleanor would have wanted it this way, that the ring she had worn with love should continue to represent love, not loss. When I slid it onto his hand, he closed his eyes for a moment, and I knew he was thinking of her. And then he opened them and looked at me, and the past and the present seemed to fold together into a single, unbroken thread. We danced under strings of lights that Margaret had hung from the barn rafters, with music drifting from an old radio tuned to the only station we could get. Locusts sang in the fields, and the stars came out in numbers that made the mountains look small. At one point, Margaret cut in, and I watched from the sidelines as she and her father swayed awkwardly together, neither of them quite knowing the steps but neither willing to let go. Beside me, Rosa wiped her eyes and said, "I never thought I'd see the day when the three scariest people in Silver Creek, a hermit, a spinster, and a schemer, turned into a family." I laughed and leaned my head on her shoulder. Neither did I. Margaret stayed in the spare room, and we settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. She took over the farmer's market stall that I had once run alone, and her sharp business sense turned our modest vegetable stand into one of the most popular in the county. She had a gift for branding, for presentation, for knowing what people would pay a premium for. The land that her grandfather had purchased with railroad money, and that her grandmother had protected with a secret, was finally being worked by blood again, and the irony of it all was not lost on any of us. The farm expanded, not with new acres but with new purpose. We added a small greenhouse for winter greens, renovated the old barn into a space for community suppers, and started hosting monthly potlucks where anyone from Silver Creek was welcome. The boycotts and whispers were gone. In their place was a steady trickle of neighbors who wanted to buy our honey, our preserves, our heirloom tomatoes. The land was no longer a fortress. It was a bridge. Then in late September, something happened that I had stopped believing was possible. I had been feeling tired for weeks, dizzy in the mornings, and I had blamed it on the heat and the long hours. But Rosa, who missed nothing, cornered me after one of the potlucks and said, "Clara, when was your last cycle?" I stared at her, and the world went very still. I had been irregular my whole life, had been told by a doctor in Pueblo that children were unlikely. Thomas and I had never used protection. There had seemed no need, and I had made peace with the idea that I would be a stepmother to Margaret and a wife to Thomas, and that would be enough. But Rosa's question sent me to the drugstore in town, and then to the clinic in Glenwood Springs, and then to a doctor who looked at the test results and said, "Mrs. Wheeler, you're about 10 weeks pregnant." I sat in the parking lot for an hour after that appointment, my hands on the steering wheel, watching the aspen leaves turn gold on the mountainside. I was 32 years old, and I was carrying the child of a man who had buried one wife and never thought he would love again. A man who had spent 5 years believing his chance at a family was buried under a cottonwood tree. I drove home in a daze, and when I walked into the kitchen, Thomas was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. He turned and saw my face, and the spoon clattered to the floor. "Clara, what is it?" I couldn't speak. I just took his hand and pressed it against my belly, the way I had seen women do in movies, the way I had never imagined myself doing in real life. He understood instantly. He went pale, then red, and then his eyes filled with tears, and he pulled me into his arms with a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "You're sure?" he whispered into my hair. "The doctor is sure," I said, and we stood there in the kitchen holding each other while the stew burned on the stove and neither of us cared. We told Margaret that evening after supper. She had become so much a part of our lives that it never occurred to us to wait. We sat her down in the living room, and Thomas, his voice shaking with joy and nerves, said, "You're going to have a little brother or sister." Margaret's face went through a dozen expressions in the span of a breath: shock, confusion, something that might have been jealousy, and then, at last, a bewildered delight. She looked at me, then at her father, then back at me. "Is that even possible?" she asked, and I laughed because I had asked the same question of the doctor. "Apparently it is," I said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up, walked around the coffee table and hugged me, a real hug, full and warm, the kind I had never expected from her. "I always wanted a sibling," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I just never thought it would be younger than my own children someday. That winter was the happiest of my life." The farm slept under a thick blanket of snow, and I grew round and slow, and Thomas fussed over me like a mother hen, and Margaret took over the heavy lifting with a quiet competence that made me proud. We spent the dark evenings by the wood stove, reading aloud from the old books on Thomas's shelves, and the baby kicked in time to the sound of Margaret's voice reading poetry. On Christmas Eve, we walked out to the cottonwood tree, which had healed enough to be a proper tree again, and decorated it with pinecone ornaments and a single string of battery-powered lights that Margaret had found in town. We stood in the snow, the three of us, soon to be four, and Thomas said a prayer for Eleanor, for the child to come, and for the improbable, stubborn love that had brought us all together. On the night of March 15th, the same date that Eleanor had written her apology letter 7 years earlier, I went into labor. It was a hard birth, 18 hours in a hospital bed in Glenwood Springs, with Thomas holding my hand and Margaret packing the waiting room like a caged animal. But at the end of it, when the doctor placed a tiny, furious girl into my arms, all the pain dissolved into a single, piercing note of joy. She had my dark hair and Thomas's deep-set eyes, and she screamed with a ferocity that made the nurses laugh. We named her Eleanor Patricia Wheeler, Ellie, for the grandmother who had shaped all of our fates, and for the grandmother who had sacrificed her own truth to protect a marriage. When we brought her home to the farm, Margaret held her for the first time and whispered, "Hello, little sister. You have no idea how much you're already loved." That summer, we planted a new cottonwood sapling next to the old one, a daughter tree for a daughter. Margaret dug the hole and Thomas placed the roots, and I held baby Ellie in a sling against my chest while we filled the earth. The four of us stood in the golden light of a July evening, and I thought about the Thursday suppers that had started it all: the venison stew, the sourdough bread, the quiet hope I had been too afraid to name. I had whispered a question on a porch in October, and the universe had answered with a life so full that I sometimes had to stop and remind myself it was real. But here is what I did not know on that July evening. There was one more secret under the cottonwood tree. The following spring, when the ground thawed, Thomas decided to properly reset Eleanor's headstone, which had shifted slightly during the fire. As we dug down to shore up the foundation, my shovel struck something hard, not rock but wood. A second box, smaller than the first, buried deeper and wrapped in oilcloth so thick it had survived the flames and the years. Inside was a tiny pair of baby shoes, hand-stitched, and a note in Alina's handwriting dated just one day before she died. It said only this: "For the daughter I couldn't give you, I hope you find her." Thomas read it and wept, and I understood finally that Alina had known about Margaret all along. She had carried that secret to protect Thomas from pain, but she had also left these shoes as a prayer, a hope that someday, somehow, he would get a daughter after all. We buried the shoes again under the new cottonwood next to the old one and marked the spot with a small stone no one would notice. A secret gift from one mother to another, from one generation of Wheelers to the next. Today, the farm is thriving. Ellie is 4 years old, with a laugh that fills every corner of the house and a stubborn streak that reminds me of her sister. Margaret runs the market business and has started dating a kind young man from Grand Junction who doesn't mind the complicated history of the family he's joining. Thomas is 70 now, his hair fully silver, his hand still steady on the tractor wheel. Every Thursday we still eat a special supper together, a tradition that started with a widower and a neighbor and grew into a family of 4. And sometimes when the light is low and the mountains turn purple, I walk out to the cottonwood trees, the old and the new, and I remember the moment on the porch when I whispered, "What if I said yes?" That whisper, which could have been nothing, became a marriage, a daughter, a sister, a home. It became proof that some of the best things in life are not planned. They are simply said out loud, into the quiet, and allowed to grow. People ask me sometimes if I was afraid that night on the porch. Afraid of rejection, of humiliation, of what the town would say about a woman half Thomas's age stepping toward a widower with her heart in her hands. And the truth is, I was terrified. My voice shook so badly I wasn't sure the words would come out whole. But here is what I have learned in the years since. Every important thing I have ever done has been done while afraid. That whisper, "What if I said yes?" was not courage. It was simply the moment when the fear of staying silent finally grew larger than the fear of speaking. And that distinction, that small pivot from hiding to asking, is what separated the life I had from the life I now live. The cottonwood trees on the eastern pasture are taller now, the old one fully healed, the young one stretching into its own. Ellie asks about the grandmother she never met, and we tell her stories about Alina, not the tragic figure of the town's memory, but the woman who loved so fiercely that she tried to protect her husband even from beyond the grave. We tell her about Patricia, too, the sister who sacrificed her own happiness to raise a child in secret, and about Margaret, who walked into our lives as an enemy and stayed as a daughter. The land has become a map of these women, each of them leaving a mark, and I have come to believe that the Wheeler farm is not just 40 acres of Colorado soil. It is a testament to the quiet, complicated, stubborn love that women carry, sometimes across generations, often without recognition. Thomas turned 75 last spring. He moves more slowly now, his hands a little stiffer on the tractor wheel, but his eyes are still that same clear gray that held mine on the porch all those years ago. He says the farm has never looked better, and I think he means it not just about the crops, but about the sound of children's feet on the wooden floors, the laughter in the kitchen, the way the house no longer feels like a museum of grief. Every Thursday we still eat a special supper. Margaret drives up from Grand Junction with her husband and their little boy, and Rosa comes with her wife, and sometimes Father Michael wanders in with a loaf of bread and a story about the old days. The table is crowded and loud, and I find myself looking around the room with a wonder that has never quite faded. This family began with a casserole dish and a widower who had forgotten how to accept kindness. That is not an exaggeration. That is the literal sequence of events that built my life. If there is a larger truth here, it is this. The world is full of people standing on porches, holding something fragile in their hearts, waiting for permission to say it out loud. We tell ourselves stories about why we cannot ask the question, why we cannot knock on the door, why the risk is too great and the cost too high. And sometimes those stories are even true. But sometimes, more often than we think, they are just stories. Thomas Wheeler believed his chance at love was buried under a cottonwood tree. I believed I was meant to be alone. Margaret believed she was unworthy of belonging to anyone. And all three of us were wrong, beautifully and completely wrong, because one evening in late October, a venison stew went cold on a porch rail, while a woman trembling with fear decided to ask the question that changed everything. If you are standing on a porch right now, metaphorically or literally, holding back the words that could remake your world, let this be your permission. You do not need to be fearless. You only need to be 1% more hopeful than you are afraid. The rest of the story will write itself in ways you cannot predict, and some of those ways will be hard, but some of them will be so beautiful that you will look back at the person you were before you spoke, and you will not recognize their loneliness. That is not a guarantee, but it is a possibility, and possibility, I have learned, is the thing that keeps us alive. Thank you for spending this time with our family. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who might need a reminder that it is never too late to ask the question. And if you have your own Thursday supper waiting somewhere, a door you have been meaning to knock on, a joke you have been meaning to answer seriously, maybe today is the day you step forward and whisper your own yes.